Excellent. Great. Well, I'm pretty excited to be talking to you today. Thank you all for signing on. I used to say thank you for being here. I guess it's the same. Thank you for signing on, for being here to hear about what I want to share with you today. John said I'm an ecologist and a biogeochemist, and I study the interactions between Earth and atmosphere, trying to understand both the drivers of climate change, but also ways that we can slow climate change. And today I want to talk about the latter, and particularly how we can recapture wasted carbon and use it for climate change mitigation. But before I get too far into the nitty-gritty details, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Now, I know that everybody here understands that atmospheric CO2 is increasing, and that's driving climate change, and that there are other gases involved. Nitrous oxide and methane are two very potent greenhouse gases. This is just a projection of atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations over time to 2050. And you can see that CO2 is going up. We know that's driving climate change. We also know that we have to reduce emissions if we're going to solve the climate crisis. So this is a hypothetical emissions reduction scenario, this dotted black line. And what do you see? You see that CO2 concentrations continue to go up and the Earth continues to warm. What a lot of people don't realize is that emissions reduction alone is no longer sufficient to slow or even stop climate change, that we have to combine emissions reduction with CO2 removal. There was a key report that came out in 2018 from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a consortium of scientists from around the world that summarize the best available data that's been published in the peer-reviewed literature. And the consensus report that came out in 2018 was that all pathways that limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and remember, we've already warmed the planet 1 degree. So this is just limiting it to half a degree more. All pathways that limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius with limited or no overshoot project the use of carbon dioxide removal on the order of 100 to 1,000 gigatons of CO2 over the century. That's a lot of CO2. In carbon terms, if you think about carbon, it's 27 to about 270 gigatons of carbon. So in addition to emissions reduction, not instead of it, but in addition to emissions reduction, we have to come up with strategies to remove carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So I sat around a little over a decade ago trying to figure out if there was anything that I do, that my group studies, that could contribute to solving this problem. How do we remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? Remember, I'd spent most of my career studying the causes of climate change, and I was getting more and more worried. I wanted to think about what could we do to help slow this, or ideally stop it and reverse it. And then I started to think about how carbon is distributed and moves in the Earth system. And just to share that with you, there's about 760 petagrams of carbon in the atmosphere. A petagram is the same as a gigaton. It's 10 to the 15th grams. It's a lot of carbon. So there's about 760 petagrams in the atmosphere. The vegetation at a global scale holds about 610 petagrams. But the soil holds much more, about 2,000 petagrams, or likely more. The more recent estimates, most of these are generated by models because it's a big brown box and we don't know exactly how much is there, estimate up to about 3,500 petagrams or more of carbon. So there's a lot more carbon and carbon storage potential in the soil than there is in plants or the atmosphere. How does carbon get into the soil? Well, through photosynthesis, right? So plants absorb photosynthesis, just like we take in oxygen when we breathe. Plants absorb CO2, they respire oxygen, we respire CO2. So these plants are absorbing CO2, they're converting it into plant parts, stems and leaves and fruits and flowers, and roots that inject carbon into soil. So roots are like carbon injectors that move carbon directly from the atmosphere into the soil. And then also when those plants die, they deposit their tissues on and in the soil, and that eventually gets incorporated into the soil organic carbon pool. Now, Microbial respiration returns some of that carbon to the atmosphere. That's a normal, natural process. We don't want to mess with that. That's very important. If we didn't have those microbes, we would be buried in our own waste. But some of the carbon that gets deposited on or in the soil gets trapped. And any carbon that moves from the atmosphere to the soil and gets trapped there and stays there contributes to climate change mitigation. Why would people want to move carbon from the atmosphere to the soil? Well, the vehicle for moving carbon is organic matter. Organic matter is about 40 to 50% carbon on a dry mass basis. And of course, anybody who gardens or has farmed in the past knows that carbon-rich or organic-rich soils tend to be the most fertile. They hold more water. Organic matter holds about 2.5 times the amount of water per unit volume as the mineral soil does. Soil organic matter is sticky, so it helps hold soil together, and it contributes to soil stability, limiting erosion. And all of this contributes to sustainability and productivity of ecosystems. So you don't have to work hard to convince farmers and ranchers, for example, to increase the soil organic matter content or the carbon content of their soils. They know quite well that that is good management. So we were interested in figuring out whether or not you could manage ecosystems, and particularly working lands. And in this talk, I'm going to be talking about mostly rangelands, grazing lands, but also croplands. If you can manage these working lands to contribute to climate change mitigation. And the way we did that was we started off by building a model, an Earth systems model. So we thought about everything we could think of in the Earth systems, the emissions, the concentration in the atmosphere, the radiative forcing or the physics in the atmosphere that drive heating, and then the climate response. And I worked with one of my graduate students, Allegra Mayer, Zeke Housefather, who was a graduate student at Berkeley at the time, and Andrew Jones, who's a scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, where I also hold an appointment. And we built this model to look at the potential of carbon uptake out of the atmosphere into our working lands using 2 different representative concentration pathways or emission scenarios. And these emission scenarios are models in and of themselves that are generally accepted by the scientific community as future conditions, right? So the 2 that I'm going to talk about today are 2 of the most commonly used. One of them is RCP 8.5, which is an emissions scenario that shows pretty much business as usual. So this is a lot of emissions going forward, kind of what we're doing today. And then the other one I want to focus on is RCP 2.6, which is our best case scenario. And as you can see, what happens to emissions here is it goes up and up until about 2040. And then we begin to decline and actually go below 450 parts per million in the atmosphere of CO2. So this is a very ambitious, aggressive projection of future emissions, this future emission scenario, but this is what we're aiming for. So I'm going to explore both of those today in our model. And the first question we asked is, how much carbon would we need to remove from the atmosphere, no matter how we did it, using any approach? How much carbon would we have to remove every year to see a detectable effect on global temperatures by 2100, by the end of the century? And we picked a detectable effect as 0.1 degrees Celsius. And you may be thinking, 0.1 degrees Celsius? I mean, that's nothing. That's a tiny little temperature change. But at a global scale, it's quite significant, especially when you remember that we're trying to keep temperature warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We've already warmed 1 degree. We only have 0.5 degrees warming to go before we hit that target. So 0.1 degrees is 20% of the way. So this was a conservative estimate. What could we do with how much carbon would we have to remove from the atmosphere to reach that 0.1 degrees Celsius? And when we do the math and run it through our model, and I won't go into all the details here about how we did this and what this graph means, but what you need to know is that 0.1 degrees Celsius mark is right here. And to get there, we would have to remove 0.68 gigatons of carbon per year. Okay, remember that number, 0.68 gigatons of carbon per year to see a 0.1 degrees cooling in the atmosphere. That's just simple chemistry and physics. Now, that's with RCP 2.6 over here. What happens with a closer to business as usual emissions scenario? If we continue to emit at a high level, well, then it's going to take a lot more carbon removed from the atmosphere to reach that 0.1 degrees Celsius target. So 1.5 gigatons of carbon would need to be removed annually to reach that target within a standard era. Okay, so how much carbon could we actually remove using the practices that we know today in agriculture actually are carbon friendly, that actually result in soil carbon sequestration? So we took all the available data that was out there already in the literature that's relatively well accepted, and we looked to see what we could get. And we looked at a high range, a low range, and then right here, this first column here is the average range. And the practices that we looked at were things like biochar, right? That's burnt up organic matter that's usually left over from an industrial process. This is kind of the rage right now. Everybody's interested in biochar. We looked at just improved cropland management, things like cover crops, reduced tillage, and irrigation management, fertilizer management. And then we also looked at improved management on rangelands. And what we found was if you combine all the possible approaches, you come up with an average carbon sequestration rate at an annual basis at a global scale of 1.9 gigatons of carbon per year. Well, that was pretty cool, because to reach that 0.1 degrees Celsius target of cooling with an aggressive emissions reduction, we would have needed 0.68 to come out. And even with a high emission scenario, we would have needed 1.25, and we're still exceeding that with our average rate here. So what this tells us is that there's potential to use management of working lands, agricultural lands, to help lower temperature. So we looked at what the combined potential when we include biochar and when we don't include biochar. And the reason we took biochar out of the equation for some of these analyses was because there's a lot of uncertainty about how well biochar actually works for carbon sequestration. So without biochar, we definitely can reach our 0.1 degrees Celsius target. But when we include all of our options here, we get almost to 0.3 degrees. We can almost get 60% of the way that we need to get to by 2100 with using natural and working lands. Now, this is a model, and a model is only as good as our understanding of how ecosystems function, and that in itself is somewhat faulty. But this tells us that this is a worthwhile activity to pursue. So let's move on. We looked at standard procedures that are already well known to sequester carbon, but we wondered if there were other things out there that we could do that would be better, that would potentially sequester more carbon at the same time as reducing emissions. So we wondered about organic matter amendments to grasslands, and I'll explain why we picked that. We picked grasslands because grasslands tend to occur in regions where there's more water loss from ecosystems than water coming in. So grassland ecosystems tend to occur in regions where they experience drought for part of the year, sometimes for a lot of the year. And anytime you expose a plant or an ecosystem of plants to severe drought, the plants start having to look for water. And over evolutionary time, these plants have developed mechanisms to find that water by creating more roots. And remember earlier I said that all roots really are a mechanism to inject carbon into soils, if you're a carbon cycle scientist like I am. And here we're working in an ecosystem where we've got plants that have been programmed over evolutionary time to inject carbon into soils. So healthy grasslands, very well functioning grasslands, tend to be very carbon rich ecosystems. So one of the reasons we picked grasslands was because these ecosystems have plants that are well adapted to putting carbon into the soil. Grasslands are geographically expansive. They cover about 30% of the global land surface, about 30% of the US land area, And here in California, where I live and work, about 23 million hectares of our area is in grasslands, which is 40% of the state. So it's an important ecosystem type, and it's actually the dominant land use type globally. And then finally, the other reason why we picked grasslands is because the majority of grasslands globally are degraded with regard to carbon, meaning that overuse, and particularly overgrazing, as you can tell from this fence line comparison, has resulted in a lot of carbon loss from these ecosystems. So you can think of these grasslands as being bathtubs that are half full of carbon. And we wanted to see if we could manage these systems to help fill that bathtub back up. So again, we had to do a thought experiment. This is a very simple model then this time, what we did to see if this would be worthwhile. Let's just take my state, 23 million hectares of grasslands in California, and let's say half of it's available for carbon sequestration projects. Only half of that land is either accessible or it's held by people who are interested in participating with this. And let's pick a low rate of carbon sequestration, 0.5 metric ton of carbon per hectare per year. That's a very low rate, especially when you look outside of the natural and working land sector. People kind of laugh at that rate. But we have a lot of land area available. So if you took half the land area in California and you sequestered carbon at 0.5 metric ton of carbon per hectare per year, you would essentially sequester 21 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents on an annual basis. And if you could up that rate to 1 metric ton of carbon per hectare per year, you would sequester 42 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent annually. Well, what does that mean? I mean, if you don't live and breathe this stuff every day like I do, it may not make a lot of sense. So let's put it in perspective. Livestock manure management, which is a very large source of greenhouse gas emissions in the state, emits about 12 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent annually. So at a low rate, we'd more than offset livestock manure management. Household energy use in California emits about 25 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent annually. So at a low rate, we'd almost offset all of household energy use. And electrical generation in the state is 39 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent annually. So at a high rate, we'd offset all of electrical generation and more. So this told us, this looks like it's a worthwhile activity. Let's move on. So the first thing we needed to do was determine whether or not we could actually detect changes in carbon in soils and grassland systems. You know, funny, people hadn't really looked deeply at this, especially in California in our Mediterranean climate. So we went out and we sampled 35 fields in Marin and Sonoma County very intensively. We picked 2 counties because that way we could control for cover type and plant type, slope, aspect, and climate. So we kept as many things constant as we could, and then we looked at different changes in management, or just differences in management. And this is what we found. We found that there was a lot more carbon in soils that had been amended with organic matter than soils that hadn't been amended. Now, amendments, what are those? Well, in California, we have a lot of dairy cattle. In fact, California is the biggest dairy producer nationally. And dairy cows produce a lot of waste, so do beef cattle. Most beef cattle spend most of their life cycle roaming around on the range. Most dairy cattle don't. And so that cattle manure collects on dairy farms and they need to get rid of it. So what do? They drive over grasslands and rangelands all over the region and they spray that manure out. So these amended fields had received cattle manure and they had about 50 metric tons of carbon per hectare more than the fields that hadn't been amended. That's a huge increase in soil carbon. So the first thing is, wow, yeah, we can detect differences in soil carbon with management, and there's something happening here with these amendments. But one of the problems with dairy cattle or any cattle manure amendment is that it's a really high emitter of greenhouse gas. So livestock manure, this is livestock manure in the red, compared with other sources of greenhouse gases using the EPA data and then data my lab has collected. This is methane on the left, nitrous oxide on the right, 2 very potent greenhouse gases. manure management is equivalent to coal mining for methane emissions, and it's equivalent to mobile combustion for nitrous oxide emissions. So cattle manure is not going to solve our problem if we just put it out as it is. But look down here, just note, composting is a very low emitter, barely even shows up on methane, gives off a little bit of nitrous oxide. We took data that we collected in the field and again modeled it out into the future. And what we found was that manure amendments lead to so much nitrous oxide and methane emissions that they essentially offset all of the benefit in soil carbon, and they end up as a big source to the atmosphere. So this is a difference plot, and there'll be a few of these throughout my talk. Anything below the line is a sink, meaning it's taking it out of the atmosphere, and anything above the line is a source to the atmosphere, meaning it's contributing to climate change. So here for methane, we get a little bit of methane uptake, but not a lot. Here's our soil carbon, and this is actually a lot of soil carbon sequestration, but the emissions are so high that they swamp the soil carbon. So manure amendments in and of themselves are not going to work. But what happens if we compost those amendments? Composting is a process in which you take organic amendments, mix them to create kind of the perfect meal for microbes so that they create a material that's hard for them to break down. They'll take it to a point and they can't take it any further because of the chemical and physical composition of the material. And so we put it through a composting system at a commercial composting facility. You can see here that we carefully measure the greenhouse gas conditions as well as the conditions inside the pile. And then we land applied that material in a very thin layer just once in 2008. So we sampled all the soils prior to adding the compost. Then we added the compost in a single very thin layer, about a ½ inch. This is what it looked like afterwards. You can see it's just a little bit darker. And then we sampled it annually to 2013, and then we went back in 2018 after 10 years and sampled it again. Remember, just a one-time amendment. And this is what we found. The first thing we found was that we saw a big increase in surface soil carbon. This is surface soil carbon in metric tons of carbon per hectare, just the top 10 centimeters, so not very deep. And you may be thinking, well, yeah, you're adding carbon, you're adding compost to the soil. I hope you'd be able to find it again. Well, we had an army of undergraduates sitting in the lab that sorted through every single soil sample that we brought in. And this is now in the many thousands of soil samples. And if you feel bad for the undergraduates, there's music and drinks and cookies that we make for them. So they're pretty happy and they get paid. They sit there with tweezers and they pick out every organic fragment that we can find in those samples. So what we're looking at is only the carbon that gets incorporated into the soil and is no longer recognizable as compost or plant material. So this is the increase that we're seeing. And when we look in the top 30 centimeters, and here's another one of those difference plots, we see a lot of sequestration. So here, this is the zero number. Anything below the line would mean a carbon in the treatment plots is below the controls. And it turned out that when we started in 2008, just as a random selection of plots, the treatment plots had a little less carbon than the controls. Here's where the compost was added. And here's our subsequent sampling through 2013. It was fluctuating around zero, but some years was a little higher, a lot of variability. But when we get to 10 years out, we see this really big increase. And so some of this is the compost that was added, but most of it is an increase in plant growth. And over the 10 years, we sequestered 1.8 plus or minus 1.7 metric tons of carbon per hectare over 10 years. So just to prove to you that the plant growth was contributing, here's the first 3 years. The red bars are the compost plots, the blue bars are the controls. This is biomass. By the way, the ranchers that we worked with on this, they were ecstatic. This is forage for their cattle. This means that they don't have to buy outside feed. So in some cases, we almost doubled the amount of forage that they produced by adding compost. Then we had 2 drought years. The compost plot still did a little better than the other plots, the controls. And by 10 years, we're still seeing a biomass effect. So it was very striking. So over the 10 years, we sequestered about 0.7 to 1.1 metric tons of carbon per hectare per year over 10 years, following a one-time amendment. Now, remember that earlier graph I showed you with our thought experiment, that if we could sequester 1 metric ton of carbon per hectare per year over half of the rangelands in California, we could offset residential and commercial energy use. That's pretty significant. So this suggests that that is within reach. One of the things that people are often very concerned about is what happens to biodiversity when you add organic matter amendments to soils, particularly because these amendments do carry some nitrogen and other nutrients with them. That's why the plants grow more. But we didn't see an increase in significant changes in biodiversity, and we didn't see an increase in noxious invasive weeds. So that was a good sign, and that's something we're continuing to follow. We've now gone and done this throughout the state of California to try to test it across a wide range of rangelands and on privately held ranches that have a wide range of management. And we're finding exactly the same results, although in some cases it's even more profound. In some cases, we're getting up to an average of 2 metric tons of carbon per hectare per year over the first few years of after the amendments. And we also see an increase in plant production, forage production in these sites, again, which is something that the ranchers are quite ecstatic about. The NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, used our data to develop a new protocol for ranchers to apply for EQIP grants so that they can get money, pardon me, so that they can get funding to help make this go. When you increase the organic matter content, you increase the water holding capacity. This is work we did with a colleague that shows that as as you achieve different soil organic matter contents, you increase the soil moisture, which is drought insurance in these ecosystems. Okay, but what's going to happen with future climate change? So, you know, I'm a climate change scientist. I'm talking about compost, but we know that compost on those rangelands are going to experience different conditions in the future. The models say for the state of California and for most of the US and internationally that the world is getting warmer. But the models really differ about whether or not it's getting drier or getting wetter. And so we needed to explore both scenarios. We explored a wetter scenario. The wetter scenario is the CAN ESM model. The drier scenario is the Hadley model. And then we used 2 RCPs, 2 emission scenarios. This is the business as usual, RCP 8.5. And then this is also an optimistic emissions reduction scenario, 4.5. But this is California's target. They've decided not to use 2.6 like we did in our original study. They've upped it to 4.5. So that allows for a little bit more emissions. And again, this is a difference plot. So here's 0. And we added compost at the 0 point here in the model. This is modeling all the sites that we did our fieldwork on. And what we see over the subsequent 85 years to the end of the century is that all of these sites maintain their soil organic matter pools, their soil carbon pools to the end of this period, to the end of the century. Regardless of emission scenario, regardless of climate, both warming and temperature. And very surprising to us, but is now starting to really show up in our data, is that these drier sites in Tulare and Santa Barbara counties have some of the higher sequestration rates. We're not quite sure why. It's a curious result, but something that we're following through on. Okay, I just want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about the fact that you can't draw a line around grasslands and say that's all we care about, right? There, especially from an emissions perspective, there's going to be emissions that are going to be created during the composting process, during the transportation process. There's also going to be emissions that are saved via avoided emissions from landfills or slurry ponds, or from not needing to put commercial fertilizers onto, like inorganic fertilizers onto soils. And then of course, there's also the ecosystem and the grazer impacts. So we needed to consider all of that in our model. So we put together a life cycle assessment model to look at that. And we compared it with the business as usual practice, which is manure amendments and nitrogen fertilization. And what do we end up with? Well, this graph is the global warming potential in million metric tons of CO2 equivalents. Anything above the line is emissions, anything below the line is savings. Here's the compost, here's the manure, here's the fertilizer, and all of them emit some greenhouse gas. But only compost has the negative emissions, and most of these negative emissions are from avoided emissions. Most of this is coming from taking waste out of high emitting waste streams like landfills or slurry ponds, or even combustion systems where people burn waste, and putting it into a composting system. And if you look at just 5% of the rangelands in California and look at what the net effect is, that's what these gray boxes are. The net effect is very large. So if we applied compost to just 5% of rangelands in California, we would offset a year of emissions from household energy use. That would be the net effect. So it's pretty significant. Where are we going from here? Well, we're now looking at food waste compost. This is a place where the Rotary Club can really play a role, is getting food waste out of the garbage bin and into the compost bin. There are now many municipalities that have curbside composting. Berkeley is one of them. San Francisco is working on it. New York is striving for this. We've met with all these folks to try to help them develop curbside composting, but this is an area where there's tremendous potential. This is wasted carbon and wasted nutrients. And if we captured these resources and put them through a composting system, which by the way, provides jobs and opportunities for people. And folks worry about the smell, but actually it's not too bad, especially once you get past that first few days, it really does smell quite nice, that nice earthy compost smell. So there's tons of potential there. We're also looking at other amendments. Whoops. We're looking at ground rock amendments, another waste product that can geologically sequester carbon. And then of course, biochar, because that's the in thing right now. And we wanted to see if biochar would work. We're looking at these amendments alone and in combination. And we're also measuring emissions throughout the process of this. So this is a commercial composting facility where we're measuring greenhouse gas emissions. And I just wanted to mention that all of this work is part of the Marin Carbon Project, which is a consortium of stakeholders, scientists, the Marin Agricultural Land Trust, the university extension and university researchers, ranchers, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and a variety of other stakeholders who have come together because they wanted to do something about climate change. This is really a model, in my mind, of a way to organize people, to get folks together, to try to come up with solutions and implement those solutions in their communities. So just my take home is really quickly is that carbon dioxide removal plus emissions reduction are required to slow climate change. That composting is just one solution that holds considerable promise. It's not going to solve the problem, but it certainly could be part of a portfolio that can have a significant impact. We need to stop wasting that carbon by throwing it into landfills and slurry ponds. And then secondly, thirdly, we should look at our working lands. Our working landscapes can contribute to climate change mitigation, and they often do that with co-benefits. So there's a financial gain for farmers and ranchers to participate in solutions. We just need to get our legislators on board with this and help create the right environment to help these people move into these solution-based approaches. And with that, I will stop, and I'm happy to take questions or comments.
Dr. Silver, that is wonderful and greatly appreciated. And I'm sure there's lots of questions. But I would like to ask you this one thing. You said 5% of acceptance would make a huge difference. And that's in California. Am I correct in that?
That's right. Yeah, 5% of the land area in California. That's an area that's only part of Marin County where we've been working.
Right. So the question I have is um, the level of acceptance across the country on rangeland and the willingness people have in order to change the way they've been doing it. What's your take on the level of acceptance outside of California and across the country?
Well, it's really interesting that you asked that, John, because this project, this research, which has now been going on for about a decade, helped spur California's Healthy Soils Initiative, which has now been picked up by many states across the country. And I've never had a rancher or a farmer come up to me, and I've never heard of one saying, oh, this is a bad idea. Mostly they're worried about whether or not there's enough compost to go around. And so compost is a limiting factor, and getting the waste out of the waste stream and into that organic rich material out of the waste stream and into a composting system and building composting systems is really where we need to invest our effort. I don't think implementation or adoption is going to be a problem. We have ranchers and farmers all over the country who are looking for compost to try to do this. And you need to remember, this wasn't a liberal Berkeley scientist coming up with this idea. This came from ranchers and farmers. I guess I didn't tell you guys that story, but it's kind of a funny little story in that when we were looking for things that we could do using our skills in my lab to contribute to climate change mitigation, I met with a rancher and a range manager from California who were interested in meeting with scientists. And the range manager said, well, why don't you look at compost amendments? Because I had pointed out that manure was probably a bad idea. And I said, nah, that's not going to work. It's going to be a high emitter of greenhouse gas. And I think that it's not going to pencil out. And he got into a pretty good argument with me. It turns out this guy has a PhD and he's really smart. And he'd been working with ranchers, all throughout his region, several of whom had been using compost, several of whom had shown, really good results for their forage production. And so I finally gave in and I said, fine, I'll go ahead and put compost out. We'll study it and I'll show you that you're wrong. And of course he was right and I was wrong. But it just goes to show you that, these ranchers had tried a lot of different things. Same with farmers. Farmers have tried lots of different things on their lands, and they have a lot of, important innate information that we can use to help look for climate solutions. It's just nobody had quantified it before. We just came through and used our tools to measure it and show that, yeah, this really does work quite well. So I honestly don't think adoption is going to be a problem. I think creating incentives, financial incentives would be helpful to move it out more quickly.